On April 12, 1861, the pre-dawn stillness of Charleston Harbor was shattered by a single explosion. A 10-inch mortar shell traced a glowing arc across the dark sky toward Fort Sumter. The shell exploded directly over the masonry fortification, signaling the start of the Confederate bombardment. Fort Sumter sat isolated on an artificial island, a target for the surrounding Confederate batteries. Inside the fort, 85 soldiers of the United States Army prepared for an inevitable clash. Major Robert Anderson commanded the small garrison, facing overwhelming odds and dwindling supplies. For 4 months, these men had been surrounded by a new and hostile revolutionary government. The opening shots marked the end of decades of compromise and the start of a bloody conflict. This war would ultimately claim the lives of over 600,000 American citizens. The crisis at Fort Sumter proved that political rupture had finally moved beyond diplomacy. Following Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, 7 Southern states declared their withdrawal from the Union. They formed the Confederate States of America, claiming federal property as their own sovereign territory. Southern leaders argued that coastal forts like Sumter now belonged to the new Confederacy. For Lincoln, surrendering the fort meant acknowledging the legitimacy of the Southern secession. To the south, a federal garrison in Charleston Harbor was a foreign occupation of their port. By early April, the tactical stalemate at Sumter had turned into a dire logistical crisis. Major Anderson reported that his men were down to their last few days of rations. The fort, built to repel sea attacks, was now vulnerable to land-based Confederate batteries. Batteries at Fort Moultrie and Cummings Point were trained on Anderson's isolated position. In a cruel irony, the Confederate commander Beauregard had once been Anderson's student at West Point. The teacher now watched from behind stone walls as his students' guns targeted his men. In Washington, President Lincoln faced a strategic dilemma that could trigger a total war. Reinforcing the fort with warships would make him the aggressor in the eyes of the South. Evacuating Fort Sumter would effectively admit that the United States Union was dissolved. Lincoln decided on a calculated gamble. He would send a fleet with provisions only. No additional men or ammunition would be landed unless the resupply effort was met with fire. This placed the burden of starting a war squarely on the shoulders of Confederate leadership. The Confederate cabinet in Montgomery met in a state of high tension and uncertainty. Secretary of State Robert Toombs cautioned that an attack would strike a hornet's nest. Jefferson Davis believed that allowing the resupply would be an admission of Southern weakness. On April 10, Jefferson Davis ordered Beauregard to demand the fort's surrender immediately. If the Union refused to surrender, Davis commanded Beauregard to reduce the fort by force. The bombardment of Fort Sumter began at 4:30 a.m. and lasted for 34 hours. More than 3,000 shells were fired at the fort, creating a relentless storm of iron. The intense fire caused the wooden barracks inside the fort's stone walls to catch fire. The raging fires threatened to ignite the powder magazine, which would have destroyed everything. Anderson's men were exhausted, choking on smoke, and running dangerously low on ammunition. They could only fire back intermittently to save their remaining supplies as long as possible. Bonsbacher. Strangely, despite the thousands of shells fired, no soldiers were killed in the exchange. By the afternoon of April 13, with his food gone and walls crumbling, Anderson surrendered. The Union garrison evacuated the fort the next day, boarding ships for the North. The fall of Sumter acted as a chemical catalyst, unifying the northern public. A divided population was transformed into a unified front to preserve the Union. On April 15th, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. This call for troops was intended to restore order, but instead triggered a massive escalation. States like Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina viewed the call for troops as coercion. Within weeks, these critical states seceded and joined the Confederate States of America. This shift doubled the industrial capacity of the South and moved the front line to Washington. The rebellion was now transformed into a full-scale continental war. In the new Confederate capital of Richmond, officials began organizing a professional army. In Washington, General-in-Chief Winfield Scott realized 75,000 volunteers would not be enough. Both sides stopped debating legalities and started mobilizing the machinery of modern war. By May 1861, the focus shifted to controlling rail junctions and key waterways. The most critical point was the rail hub at Manassas, Virginia, near Washington. A massive clash between the mobilizing armies was now becoming inevitable. Tensions peaked as Green troops prepared for their first real experience of combat. Commanders on both sides scrambled to organize their disorganized volunteer forces. The political rupture of 1860, Speaker Sioux, had finally transformed into the physical violence of 1861. Sup 9th, Fort Sumter was just the beginning of a struggle that would define the American soul. America had torn itself apart, and the path to reunification would be paved with blood. In Washington, General Winfield Scott realized 75,000 volunteers would not be enough for a continental war. The two sides were no longer debating legalities. They were mobilizing the machinery of modern war. By May 1861, both governments focused on controlling critical rail junctions and waterways. The most critical point was the rail hub at Manassas, Virginia, near Washington. At Manassas, the first massive clash of armies was now becoming inevitable. The peace of Charleston Harbor was gone, replaced by the drumbeat of a continent-wide struggle. Decades of failed compromise had finally yielded to the terrible reality of civil war. America had torn itself apart, and the path to reunification would be paved with blood. In the executive offices of the White House, President Lincoln faced a daunting political landscape. A restless northern public demanded immediate action, regardless of the military's readiness for war. Horace Greeley's New York Tribune echoed the relentless drumbeat of "On to Richmond" headlines. Lincoln, a former frontier lawyer, had almost no military experience to guide his decisions. He was caught between the cautious advice of aging General-in-Chief Winfield Scott. The crisis was now about the very survival of the democratic experiment in America. Deeper causes had been smoldering for decades between two distinct American civilizations. At the center of the storm was the peculiar institution of chattel slavery. The North transitioned into an industrial economy fueled by free labor and railroads. European immigration provided a steady stream of labor for northern factories. In contrast, the South remained an agrarian aristocracy built on enslaved labor. For Southern planters, slavery was the foundational social and racial order. They viewed the Republic's 7 parties' rise as a direct threat to their property. The election of 1860 served as the final breaking point for the nation. Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. Deep South leaders concluded that the democratic process no longer protected them. To men like Jefferson Davis, secession was seen as a conservative act. They interpreted secession as preserving the original intent of the Founding Fathers. Davis, a West Point graduate, brought a rigid military mindset to the cause. He believed the North lacked the stomach for a long, bloody occupation. Economic policy further widened the chasm between North and South. The North pushed for high protective tariffs to shield its young industries. The South saw these tariffs as a form of colonial exploitation by the North. Southern strategists placed their faith in King Cotton diplomacy. They assumed Britain and France would intervene to secure Southern fiber. The geography of the border states became a strategic nightmare for Lincoln. Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri were slave states with dangerously divided loyalties. If Maryland joined the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. would be surrounded. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus to secure the capital. Baltimore was placed under martial law to suppress secessionist riots. Lincoln's decisive moves in Maryland demonstrated a willingness to bypass norms to secure the capital. This perceived tyranny fueled the fire in Virginia, pushing the front lines closer to Washington. By April 1861, Virginia's secession moved the war within 100 miles of the northern capital, inside the Confederate cabinet in Richmond. The strategy was based on exhaustion rather than conquest. The South did not need to invade. It only needed to survive until the North grew weary. This defensive-offensive strategy sought to protect borders while striking Union morale. For the North, the burden was much heavier: to invade, conquer, and hold vast territory. The Union High Command faced a task for which they were fundamentally unprepared. General Winfield Scott proposed the Anaconda Plan to slowly strangle the Confederacy. The plan involved blockading southern ports and seizing control of the Mississippi River. However, the press mocked Scott's strategy as being far too slow and cowardly. The Northern public demanded a 90-day war, expecting a quick and decisive victory. Lincoln felt the pressure of time more acutely than any of his military advisors. Volunteers who joined after Fort Sumter had signed on for only 3 months. By July 1861, their enlistments were beginning to expire, forcing Lincoln's hand. Lincoln met with General Irvin McDowell to finalize a plan for an offensive. McDowell argued his troops were green and lacked experience for large formations. Lincoln famously countered that the enemy was just as green and unprepared. The political necessity of victory outweighed the military risks of the operation. McDowell was ordered to move toward the rail junction at Manassas, Virginia. The Confederate Army under P.G.T. Beauregard was already digging in there. A Union victory might end the war before the volunteers' summer ended. Conversely, a defeat would validate the rebellion in the eyes of the world. The timeline was dictated, by political pressure rather than military readiness. Union enlistments were rapidly approaching their expiration dates. McDowell's force began its slow march through the humid Virginia landscape. The Green troops struggled with the heat and the weight of their equipment. The Confederate scouts watched the Union advance from the safety of the tree line. Richmond was tense as news of the Union movement reached the Southern capital. The stage would set for the first major confrontation of the Civil War. Lincoln and his cabinet met with General McDowell to finalize the Virginia offensive. McDowell argued his troops were green and officers lacked experience in large formations. Lincoln countered that the enemy was just as green as the Union forces. Political necessity outweighed the military risks of an unprepared volunteer army. The Union High Command ordered McDowell to move toward the junction At Manassas, Confederate forces under Beauregard, France were digging to to defend the strategic position. A Union defeat would validate the rebellion, while victory might end it by summer. The timeline was dictated by the approaching expiration of volunteer enlistments. By July 1861, the 90-day volunteers were preparing to march into their first battle. In Northern Virginia, the rolling hills were bisected by a meandering stream known as Bull Run. This modest waterway would soon become a household name across a deeply fractured continent. To the north sat the heights of Centreville, where the Union Army gathered its strength. To the south lay Manassas Junction, a vital logistical hub for the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. Control of this junction was essential for the Confederacy to protect their link to Richmond. It also maintained a crucial connection with their forces stationed in the Shenandoah Valley. The terrain was a dense patchwork of thickets, farm clearings, and steep-banked fords. This ground offered a significant advantage to a defending force that knew the territory well. The opposing forces were a paradox: large and well-equipped, yet entirely devoid of combat experience. Brigadier General Irvin McDowell commanded roughly 35,000 Union troops. This was the largest field army ever assembled on the North American continent. Opposing him was General P.G.T. Beauregard, the acclaimed hero of Fort Sumter. Beauregard led 20,000 Confederates dug in behind the southern bank of Bull Run. While numbers favored the Union, the quality of the troops concerned both commanders. These were not professional soldiers, but clerks, farmers, and laborers turned volunteers. They had spent more time parading in colorful uniforms than practicing complex combat maneuvers. The Union ranks featured Zouaves in red pantaloons and various state militias. This riot of color and lack of uniformity would soon cause lethal confusion. Firepower had undergone a silent revolution, though military doctrine had yet to catch up. The primary weapon was the rifled musket, such as the Springfield Model 1855. These rifled barrels, combined with the expanding Minié ball, increased lethal range significantly. Unlike smoothbores, these weapons could strike a target with lethal force at 500 yards. However, men were still trained to fight in tight, shoulder-to-shoulder formations. This mismatch between range and exposure ensured that direct assaults would be devastating. Supporting the infantry were batteries of smoothbore, 12-pounder Napoleon field guns. Rifled Parrott guns were also deployed, capable of throwing shells over 2 miles. In the hands of green crews, the effectiveness of these guns remained unpredictable. McDowell's plan was sophisticated, perhaps too sophisticated for an inexperienced army. He intended from the Coral Runway. He intended to feint an attack at Sunset Bridge while flanking the Confederate center. A long, overnight flanking march to the north was the core of his movement. McDowell planned to cross Bull Run at Sudley Springs to turn the Confederate left flank. Seizing the railroad junction would force Beauregard to either retreat or be destroyed. It was a classic turning movement designed to win through maneuver rather than bloodbath. Beauregard, meanwhile, was operating on a different set of tactical assumptions. He planned his own offensive against the Union left at Centreville. Both generals were attempting to execute complex offensive maneuvers simultaneously. General Joseph E. Johnston commanded a force 50 miles to the west in the valley. McDowell's plan relied on Robert Patterson keeping Johnston pinned down. If Johnston slipped away, he could reinforce Beauregard in a matter of hours. This represented the first time steam power would play a decisive strategic role. The Confederacy held interior lines, allowing them to shift forces rapidly between fronts, while the Union was forced to march source overland through hostile territory. McDowell struggled to organize a massive supply train of wagons. Beauregard was receiving high-level intelligence from a spy ring in Washington, D.C. She sent word of McDowell's exact departure date and route. Confederates began consolidating their defenses days before the Union reached them. The Union column finally began its march on July 16th. Soldiers were hampered by the sweltering Virginia heat and a lack of discipline. Men frequently broke ranks to pick blackberries or fill canteens. The three-day march turned into a grueling ordeal that exhausted the troops. The flanking column found the narrow wood roads difficult to navigate in the dark. By sunrise on July 21, the Union's secret movement was hours behind schedule. Union troops were still struggling toward river crossings. As the morning mist cleared, the Confederate Signal Corps used a newly developed wig-wag system. They spotted the glint of Union bayonets moving toward the north. The intelligence failure was absolute. The flanking maneuver had been detected. Confederate command began frantically shifting units to meet the threat at Matthews Hill. This loss of momentum handed the tactical initiative back to the defenders. Green Union regiments were forced to transition into a disorganized meeting engagement. The secret march had ended, and the high-stakes battle was about to begin. By dawn on July 21, the Union's secret flanking movement was hours behind schedule. Instead of a surprise dawn attack, Union troops were still struggling toward river crossings. The morning mist cleared, exposing the glint of thousands of Union bayonets to the north. Confederate signalmen spotted the movement and prepared to alert their high command. Using the wig-wag signal system, messages were transmitted across the battlefield distances. The intelligence failure was absolute. The secret Union maneuver had been detected. Confederate General Beauregard frantically shifted his units to meet the threat at Matthews Hill. The loss of momentum handed the tactical initiative back to the Confederate defenders. Green Union regiments were forced to transition from a planned march to a chaotic engagement. The sweltering heat continued to drain the strength of the inexperienced volunteers. Both armies were now locked in a high-stakes struggle for control of the junction. The first major land battle of the war was unfolding with lethal unpredictability. General McDowell's sophisticated plan had crumbled under the weight of reality. The interior lines of the Confederacy allowed for rapid reinforcement via steam power. History's first strategic use of railroads in battle was now underway. As the sun climbed higher, the scale of the coming casualty list became apparent. The volunteers realized this would not be a short or colorful parade. Virginia's hills prepared to witness the bloodiest day in American history up to that point. The stage was set for a fratricidal war that would tear the nation apart. July 21, 1861, 10 light a.m. The summer sun rose over the rolling hills of Manassas, Virginia. On the crest of Matthews Hill, Colonel Nathan Evans observed the northern horizon with growing concern. His small brigade of 1,100 Confederate soldiers waited in the tall grass, muskets held ready. Suddenly, a massive Union column began to emerge from the dense woods to the north. Evans ordered his men to pivot nearly 990 degrees to face this unexpected flanking threat. This movement was triggered by a signal from a distant watchtower several miles away. It was the first time wigwag signals were used to relay tactical intelligence in battle history. The message sent to Evans was blunt. Look out for your left. You are turned. General McDowell's elaborate flanking maneuver had finally made contact with the Southern defenders. The march had been delayed for hours by the inexperience of the Union columns. Disjointed skirmishes erupted as the Union brigades of Burnside and Porter deployed into line. Superior Union numbers and rifled muskets began forcing Evans back toward the Warrenton Turnpike. By noon, the tactical situation for the Confederates on Matthews Hill had become critical. Evans was reinforced by the brigades of Bee and Bartow, but the Union pressure was relentless. 10,000 Union soldiers pushed forward, supported by the roar of concentrated artillery fire. The Confederate line on Matthews Hill finally shattered under the overwhelming weight of the assault. Southern units broke into a disorganized retreat, streaming southward across the Young's Branch Valley. In Washington, early telegraph reports fueled a growing sense of impending Union victory. The battle seemed nearly won, but operational friction began to slow the Union pursuit. Union commanders paused to reorganize their tangled regiments, losing a vital hour of momentum. This delay granted the Confederates time to reform their defenses on the next barrier. Henry House Hill. Brigadier General Thomas Jackson had positioned his brigade of Virginians on the reverse slope. Jackson hid his troops behind the crest, shielding them from the Union's long-range rifled artillery. His smoothbore cannons were placed to command the plateau from their protected positions. Retreating remnants of Bee's and Bartow's commands found Jackson's line standing in disciplined silence. General Bee, attempting to rally his shattered 4th Alabama, pointed his sword toward Jackson. He shouted the words that would create a legend. "Look, there is Jackson standing like a stone wall." The battle now transitioned into a brutal, static struggle for control of the Henry House Plateau. At 2 p.m., McDowell ordered the elite artillery batteries of Griffin and Ricketts to the front. They deployed within 300 yards of the Confederate infantry, a tactical error born of overconfidence. Captain Griffin unlimbered his 12-pounder Napoleon cannons on the Henry House Plateau. The Union gunners positioned their pieces with a dangerous sense of overconfidence. The small timber home of Judith Henry stood alone amidst the rolling hills. Ricketts' battery opened fire, sending clouds of white smoke across the plateau. Jackson's Virginians lay hidden behind the crest, shielded from the Union fire. Suddenly, the Southern line rose and leveled their muskets at the Union gunners. A devastating volley of fire erupted from the hidden Confederate infantry. Union gunners fell near their pieces as the plateau became a killing ground. Confederate units charged forward, screaming their terrifying war cries. The momentum shifted with every desperate charge and countercharge. Heavy cannon smoke hung thick over the plateau in the afternoon heat. Discarded equipment and broken artillery littered the rolling landscape. Captain Charles Griffin squinted through his binoculars at an approaching Cinch line. A regiment of the 33rd Virginia marched forward in dark blue uniforms. The blue-clad Virginians were mistaken for friendly Union reinforcements. Griffin ordered his gunners to hold their fire as the unit approached. The 33rd Virginia leveled their muskets at point-blank range. A devastating volley of lead and fire decimated the Union gun crews. Artillery horses reared and fell in their traces near the Henry House. The loss of the batteries paralyzed the Union center. At a critical moment, Union infantry suffered under the intense July heat and relentless pressure. The 90-day volunteers began to waver. As their enlistments neared an end, Confederate counterattacks pushed relentlessly against the Union lines. The tactical initiative now swung fully toward the Southern commanders. General Joseph E. Johnston directed fresh reinforcements toward the Union flank. Southern brigades moved at a quick step along the dusty forest roads. Confederate officers on horseback led their men into the ongoing engagement. The Southern maneuver extended their line far beyond the Union right flank. A soot-covered steam locomotive pulled into the Manassas Gap station. Colonel Arnold Elzey's brigade rushed from the rail cars to the field. Elzey's fresh Southern brigade extended the line far beyond the exposed Union right flank. This marked the first time in military history a railroad delivered reinforcements to an active battle. The terrifying rebel yell echoed across the ridge as the Southern troops surged forward. Under the sudden pressure, the Union's right flank began to crumble and collapse. Units like the 14th Brooklyn and New York Fire Zouaves found themselves caught in a pincer. General McDowell observed the disintegration of his lines from his hilltop headquarters. He attempted to form a final defensive line along the Sudley Road, but the psychological breaking point had been reached. The retreat became inevitable. Exhausted men began a steady withdrawal. Believing they had been outmaneuvered, the Union columns bottlenecked at the narrow stone bridge over Bull Run. Civilian onlookers from Washington, who had come to watch, created a logistical nightmare. Roads were choked with overturned carriages, discarded equipment, and panicked spectators. Confederate artillery began ranging the bridge, sparking total panic. The steady withdrawal turned into a chaotic flight known as the Great Skedaddle. Regiments dissolved into individuals as officers lost all control of their men. The Confederate Army was too exhausted and disorganized to launch a coordinated pursuit. By sunset, the Union Army was a mass of fugitives fleeing toward Washington's safety. The Confederates occupied the field they had so nearly lost hours earlier. McDowell now faced the grim task of explaining the scale of the disaster. President Lincoln received the news of the defeat with stunned disbelief in Washington. The short war many had predicted had just become a long and bloody struggle. The Battle of Bull Run taught both North and South the true price of the conflict. In the telegraph office of the War Department, Abraham Lincoln sat in stunned silence. The morning's optimism dissolved into a series of frantic, disjointed dispatches. By late evening, on July 21, 1861, the narrative of a swift victory had been shattered. The short war policy was the first true casualty of the Battle of Bull Run. While the Confederate victory was tactically absolute, the immediate result was a paralyzing realization. The conflict had outgrown the amateurism of its first 3 months. The Union Army was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It was a fragmented mass of exhausted men clogging the roads to the capital, abandoning muskets, wagons, and the remnants of their pride in the Virginia mud. The tactical triumph belonged to the Confederacy. Yet the victory was chaotic. General Joseph E. Johnston and General P.G.T. Beauregard occupied the Henry House Hill. They were surrounded by the debris of a modern battle, shattered caissons and dead horses. The unprecedented sight of thousands of discarded rifled muskets littered the field. Confederate forces utilized the first operational use of a railroad to shift power. The logistics of steam and rail would define the future of this war. However, the victors were in no condition to exploit their success. The Southern infantry was as disorganized by their win as the Federals were by their loss. exhausted and low on ammunition. They lacked a professionalized supply train. Confederate commanders found it impossible to organize a pursuit. President Jefferson Davis arrived on the field as the firing ceased. Davis urged a march on the capital, but the units were at their limit. The operational reality made such a move a logistical impossibility. The cost of the day was recorded in the grim arithmetic of casualty lists, numbers that horrified a nation unaccustomed to industrial-scale violence. In July 1861, the figures were staggering to both the North and the South. The Union suffered approximately 2,896 total casualties. The Confederate victors paid a heavy price. Roughly 1,982 men lost. Among the dead were high-ranking officers from the social and political elite. This signaled that the war would demand a sacrifice that spared no class. These numbers represented the end of the romantic parade ground era. Northern and Southern newspapers published staggering lists of casualties, shocking the American public. The reality of industrial-scale violence now reached thousands of living rooms across the divided nation. The immediate aftermath in Washington, D.C. was one of sheer panic and political upheaval. As the sun rose on July 22nd, the city streets filled with exhausted, hungry Union soldiers. These men had walked 30 miles in a state of psychological and physical collapse. The presence of civilian soldiers, severe spectators who had watched the battle, became a source of national embarrassment. Congressmen and socialites who rode out to watch the fun now fled alongside the army. The strategic assumption of a single decisive victory causing peace was quickly replaced. A grim determination to rebuild and reorganize the Union effort began to take hold. The tactical failure at Bull Run exposed the total inadequacy of 90-day enlistments. Within 48 hours, Lincoln signed legislation calling for 500,000 volunteers. These new volunteers were required to serve for 3 full years instead of 3 months. This was the moment the Civil War transitioned from an insurrection into a total war. For the Confederacy, the victory resulted in a dangerous infusion of overconfidence. The belief that one Southerner could whip 5 Northerners seemed validated by the battle. While this boosted morale, it also fostered a myth that the war was already won. However, the tactical success did not alter the strategic reality of the naval blockade. The Anaconda Plan remained in place, slowly strangling the Southern economy. The Union's industrial base was only beginning to mobilize its immense resources. The South won the first round, but they had awakened a logistical giant. This giant would now seek to professionalize its approach to industrial destruction. The most significant consequence of the defeat followed within days. Irvin McDowell, blamed for the disaster, was relegated to a secondary role. Lincoln summoned a 34-year-old officer who had seen minor success in Virginia. This officer was George B. McClellan, known for his organizational genius. McClellan arrived in Washington with the task of forging a real army. He promised to turn the demoralized mob into the Army of the Potomac. McClellan possessed a deep understanding of European military theory and tactics. The defeat at Bull Run had created a vacuum of leadership he was eager to fill. As the smoke cleared from the Virginia plains, the strategic question of the war shifted. The short war concept was dead, replaced by an escalating crisis. The conflict now threatened the very foundations of the American Republic. Focus turned from the battlefield back to the training camps. In the cabinet rooms, a more professionalized war was being designed. Lincoln's decision to expand the army set a massive reorganization in motion. Recruitment centers across the North were flooded with new volunteers. The Union began to leverage its vast industrial base for the war effort. Railway lines became the arteries of a new logistical giant. Massive quantities of supplies were gathered for the Army of the Potomac. McClellan focused on the meticulous drilling of his raw troops. A professional military culture began to take root in Washington. The Confederacy, too, prepared for a long war of attrition. The Southern defense would be fueled by a fierce will to fight. One critical question remained unanswered. What was the ultimate goal? Would the new army seek reconciliation or total destruction? The path toward total war was now irrevocably set. The South would be touched by a force unlike any seen before. The American Republic entered its darkest hour of trial. The Battle of Bull Run was only the beginning of the end. The 1860 census predicted a nation of unprecedented growth and industrial prosperity. But soon, casualty lists began to circulate, introducing a grim new kind of accounting. The war did not remain the gentlemanly contest many had envisioned in the spring. It evolved into what historians categorize as the modern era's first total war. Distinctions between the battlefield and the civilian home front began to dissolve completely. Industrial-scale mobilization put unprecedented pressure on every aspect of American life. The immediate consequence of the 1861 campaigns was the death of the short war myth. In the North, the initial shock of defeat at Manassas was deeply felt. Shock was replaced by a grim, bureaucratic determination in the halls of Washington. It was realized that the Southern rebellion could not be suppressed by one stroke. This led to the passage of the Legal Tender Act to fund the conflict. The Internal Revenue Act further restructured the financial system for an indefinite war. The United States began transitioning from a loose confederations into a centralized state. The new state was capable of sustaining hundreds of thousands of men in the field. A 1,000-mile front now required constant industrial-scale supply and coordination. For the Confederacy, the tactical successes of 1861 left a deceptive legacy. The victory at Bull Run validated Southern beliefs in their volunteer soldiers' superiority. However, it also fostered a dangerous overconfidence that delayed necessary reforms. Reforms in logistics and command were neglected while the South celebrated invincibility. Meanwhile, the Union utilized naval superiority to tighten the blockade. This lethal strategic maneuver became known as the Anaconda Plan. The war in the East settled into a stalemate that would define the next 2 years. Seeds of Confederate defeat were sown by their inability to match Northern industrial output. The result was a war of attrition, pitting dwindling resources against a growing machine. The Northern machine grew more efficient with every passing month of the conflict. This divergence in material reality forced the Confederate government to adopt drastic measures. Measures like national conscription contradicted the very states' rights ideology they defended. The impressment of supplies further strained the relationship between the government and its people. The historical legacy is often framed through the lens of the lost cause narrative. This narrative sought to downplay the central role of slavery in the conflict. The lost cause narrative emphasized the gallantry of Southern commanders and state sovereignty. Modern scholarship has largely dismantled these claims using the secession documents themselves. These records explicitly cite the protection of slavery as the primary catalyst for war. The institution of slavery was the underlying cause that triggered the break with the Union. The debate over why America tore itself apart remains an active field in historiography. Scholars investigate the intersection of economic interests, racial ideology, and political failure. Even the numbers that define the war's massive scale remain subject to constant revision. The figure of 620,000 dead was accepted as the definitive toll for over a century. Recent demographic analysis suggests the actual number of fatalities may reach 750,000. Many died from disease and prison camps long after the formal surrender. The human cost of this fratricidal struggle extended far beyond the statistical data. This war reached into nearly every household, creating a generation defined by mourning. The emergence of the National Cemetery System began as a testament to this loss. Robert E. Lee's former estate was transformed into Arlington National Cemetery. For 4 million enslaved people, the war was a period of profound uncertainty. The Emancipation Proclamation brought a new promise of freedom in 1863. The 13th Amendment eventually abolished legal chattel slavery in the United States. The end of fighting did not resolve the racial and social tensions of the era. Reconstruction eventually gave way to decades of discriminatory Jim Crow laws. The war preserved the Union but left the struggle for civil rights unfinished. A surviving trace of this struggle remains at the Manassas National Battlefield Park. This stone house served as a tavern and later a hospital during the fighting. Inside, surgeons performed the grisly work of amputation on young men. Amputation became the hallmark of 19th century military medicine during the war. Strategic decisions made in Washington were paid for by the bodies of the young. These men from small towns had little understanding of their leaders' grand designs. The war was a tragedy of miscalculations and a failure of political imagination. This 4-year catastrophe claimed the lives of 2% of the population. The legacy of 1861 is found in scarred landscapes that define the modern United States. The promise of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment began to take shape. Reconstruction failed to resolve the deep racial and social tensions that triggered the war. A surviving physical trace of this transformation is found at Manassas National Battlefield Park. The stone house served as a tavern and later a hospital during the fighting. Inside, surgeons performed the grisly work of amputation that became a hallmark of the war. These sites remind us that strategic decisions were paid for by the bodies of young men. Young men from small towns often had little understanding of their leaders' grand designs. The war was a tragedy of miscalculation and a catastrophic failure of political imagination. This 4-year catastrophe claimed the lives of roughly 2% of the American population. The legacy of 1861 is found in enduring documents and scarred landscapes. The conflict established that the American experiment would continue as a single nation. Yet it did so at a price that remains difficult to fully comprehend. Soldiers froze in the trenches of Petersburg, suffering through long winter nights. Civilians watched their farms burn in the Shenandoah Valley as the war intensified. Families waited for letters that never arrived, forming the true history of the war. The American Civil War proved that America could survive its own internal divisions. The nation underwent a transformation so violent that it emerged as an entirely new entity. The country that emerged in 1865 was, in many ways, fundamentally different. Silent rows of headstones in Virginia marked the graves of those caught in the gears of history. Soldiers were caught in a catastrophe they could neither stop nor fully understand. The final reflection on the war is found in the stillness of the national cemeteries. The American Civil War remains the defining crucible of the modern United States.